Welcome to our 30th Salon of the Maternal Gift Economy Breaking Through series, hosted by the International Feminists for a Gift Economy. You might notice that our good friend Genevieve Vaughan, her lovely face is missing today. She's on a plane for the first time in 2 years, traveling to the United States. So wish her well on her journey, and she'll be back with us in a couple of weeks for our next salon. I'm Letitia Layson, your moderator. Today we're joined by Mary Condren and Susan Petrelli. Now, this is part 2 of Peace and War. And here in the United States, we don't have a lot of talk about peace these days. So I hope that you'll focus a little bit on that. And the challenge for listening to talks about war is that it can be challenging emotionally and psychologically. So just take a moment, get yourself grounded, and I'm going to introduce Mary Condren. Mary Condren is the director of Women's Spirit Ireland and a research fellow at the Center for Gender and Studies in the School of Histories and Humanities at Trinity College, Dublin. Her critical work concerns the roles of violence and the discourses of sacrifice in contemporary politics. Her constructive work focuses on recuperating the Indigenous female traditions of Old Europe and Ireland. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. And I'm looking forward to exploring some issues with you today, particularly around a very common narrative, which has been very important in the Western world, otherwise known as the Garden of Paradise or the Garden of Peace versus a world in permanent war. And as we all know, we are being daily bombarded these days with the horror of what is happening in Ukraine. And the question is, how do we get to that place? How do we get to the place where such horror can be envisaged yet again in the year 2022? I work as a theologian, particularly working also in some ways as an anthropologist, sociologist in some ways, looking at the question of the social imaginary. In other words, I don't confine my work to theology. I'm also interested in what's happening at the level of symbol and ritual and image throughout the world. So the Garden of Paradise story, to me, has been crucial in Western civilization. It was not as important for although the version we know best is the one that is in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, it has had a very ancient heritage. And the Hebrew Bible actually that version comes almost 2,000 years after the version in Sumer. We won't go into that today to any great extent, although I did write about it in a book previously called The Serpent and the Goddess. So we'll start with the Garden of Eden, and see how we get along. We'll go start with the serpent, because the serpent is in almost all world mythologies, and there are many reasons for that. The serpent represents ambivalence, the tragic worldview, the circular worldview that we're all familiar with from the seasons, and it also represents the DNA. And so images of the serpent are ubiquitous because they represent at a cellular level what we understand. Now, the serpent embodied ambivalence, and in the Sumerian and Babylonian traditions, we hear the words that it wavered by turns between loving and hating the gods. In some of the Egyptian stories, like the story of Gilgamesh, the serpent promised immortality, but then at the last minute snatched it away from whoever thought they were going to achieve immortality and avoid the ignominy of death. Now, in the Garden of Eden, the version that we see in the Hebrew Bible, we have this the figure of Adam and Eve. But we also have an Irish version of this story, which I'll tell you about in a minute. A very creative story. And but the main Christian interpretation of that story is that Adam and Eve were in the garden, and there was a tree of good and evil, and also the tree of life, which represented immortality. And Yahweh said to Adam and Eve, you know, you can eat for all the fruits in the garden, but you shall not touch the tree of good and knowledge. He didn't actually mention the tree of life, interestingly, for all sorts of reasons, because in old European mythology, the tree of life is central to understanding the goddess, or it's central to the sense of divinity. Okay, so the serpent in the Hebrew Bible version tempted Eve and said, you know, Asha, don't be worrying about Yahweh, you know, who knows? Why don't you go and take some of the fruit from the tree of the good and of knowledge, and you'll become like gods. And so what was wrong with becoming like God? So Eve tempted Adam, and they both disobeyed Yahweh. And the consequences were that Adam and Eve were naked, and then they tried to hide in the garden. Now, looking at that story, we can look at it in many different ways. But the way I look at it today is from some point of psychoanalysis. In other words, as human beings, we almost cannot avoid getting out of the garden, because the garden represents plenitude, it represents innocence, it represents the time when we don't necessarily have to know about good and evil. We can be as innocent as we like. It represents at some level what psychoanalysts might call a pre-Oedipal state of being, where we're taken care of in all respects in the Garden of Eden. And then, of course, some of us may want to get out of it and make choices between good and evil. And that's apparently one possible interpretation of what Adam and Eve actually did. But then they realized that they were naked, or maybe they just realized that they were not immortal anymore. They weren't going to live in the garden forever. So their nakedness signified their humanity, their living. And so in the Hebrew Bible, Yahweh comes along and has a long discourse with Adam and Eve, and he expelled the man. He settled him east of the Garden of Eden, and he stationed the cherubim and the fiery revolving sword to guard the way to the tree of life. Now, interestingly, as I said, the Hebrew version doesn't necessarily mention the tree of life to begin with, but when we read it closely, we realize that there were two trees: the tree of good and evil, or of knowledge, and the tree of life. And obviously, by getting in touch with knowledge, they might have been tempted to take the dew of immortality from the tree of life, and that was not going to be tolerated. To Eve, basically, you know, you were going to suffer pain in childbirth. Adam would labor by the sweat of his brow. The serpent would crawl upon the earth, and enmity would happen between the serpent and the woman. In other words, there's something very distinctly happening here in the sense of the enmity between the serpent and the woman, because in many traditions, the word Eve actually means serpent. And in the Hebrew Bible version, that distinction gets a little bit lost. Now, in the Irish version, it's a little bit different in the sense that there's an apocryphal story. In fact, there are several in the Irish version. And in this story, once they had been kicked out of the Garden of Eden, Eve became distraught. And but Adam and Eve, or Adam said to Eve, let's go and fast against God, because hunger striking against Yahweh was one of the ways of making Yahweh change his mind. And so Eve went into the Tigris and Adam went into the Jordan, and they stood there for several days, and all the heavens, the angels and the archangels were looking down. And finally, the nine divisions persuaded Yahweh to forgive Adam and Eve. So their fasting against Yahweh actually worked. But then what happened? Didn't Eve go and was tempted again? And this time, it was not just by the serpent, but the devil. And there's a split here between the serpent and the devil. The devil had got inside the serpent and tempted Eve. So they were tempted then for the second time. And at that point, then no forgiveness apparently might be possible. And so there's a very famous poem in Irish. It says, I am Eve, great Adam's wife. 'Twas my guilt took Jesus' life. Since of heaven I robbed my race, on his cross was my true place. In his paradise God placed me, then a wicked choice disgraced me at the counsel of the devil. My pure hand I stained with evil, for I put it forth and plucked, then the deadly apple sucked. Long as woman looks on day, shall she walk in folly's way. Winter's withering icy woe, whelming wave and smothering snow, hell to fright and death to grieve, had never been but for Eve. So all the blame for our falling into dereliction, as Heidegger would put it, falling into humanity, was placed at the door of Eve. Certainly in the literary tradition, in the Christian tradition. But now, one of the things that I notice when I go back to reading that story of Genesis is there are trace hauntings of a matri-centered or a matrixial worldview. In Genesis, it says, that is why a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and the two of them become one body. In other words, that was the matri-centered system. It was matrilocal, matri-centered, and a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and the two of them become one body. In subsequent chapters in Genesis, we'll see the struggle that continued to go on between a matriarchal society and a patriarchal one. We don't have time to go into that today, but many scholars are now outlining that distinction in the stories and the struggle that went on for quite some time. Again, the Genesis story, the man called his wife Eve because she became the mother of all the living. The serpent was always considered to be the mother of all the living. And Eve is another word for serpent. So again, we're back to the cellular signification of the DNA. But in a way, the man called his wife Eve, so the man has the right to call her Eve, but in fact, she was the mother of all the living long before the Genesis story appeared in the Hebrew Bible. But now the significant thing about the story here that I want to relate to the question of war was when Yahweh kicked them out of the Garden of Eden, he guarded the garden by a flaming sword and placed seraphim and cherubim to guard the way to the tree of life. In other words, he prevented them ever from getting back into the garden or in any way to get access to the tree of life and to taste of the dew that surrounds the tree of life in many of the mythologies of old Europe. So guarding the tree of life, and even there's one story where Adam is dying and he says to his son Seth, he says, please ask Yahweh, can I go, to let you back into the Garden of Eden and get me some of the dew of life, and that will save my life. And so, Seth goes off and asks, can he get back into the garden and get some of the dew from the tree of life? And he's told absolutely no. You've got to wait for Jesus, because the sin, the so-called original sin, which supersedes what we might call the original blessing of having been born into a Garden of Eden, where everything in nature has been given to us to enjoy as humans. Original blessing is now translated into original sin. And the only way we can get absolved from original sin will depend on Jesus and the whole paraphernalia of redemption and atonement and all that goes with it. And so that part of the story is very seldom commented on, but it's the part of the story that for me is extremely important to understand in relation to war and peace. So now, here we have a couple of images of the Madonna and Child, and we know that those images are absolutely ubiquitous in Western culture. And there are so many different versions of that image. And in monasteries and convents throughout the world, the whole question of mourning, weeping is sung every night in a very famous hymn called the Salve Regina. And this is not accidental. So here we have, Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy. Hail our life, our sweetness, and our hope. To thee do we cry, poor banished children of Eve. You know, we've been kicked out of the garden. To thee do we send up our sighs, mourning and weeping in this valley of tears. Turn then, most gracious advocate, thine eyes of mercy toward us, and after this, our exile, show unto us the blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. And so in that liturgy, there is an extreme acknowledgement of exile, of being banished, and of mourning and of weeping. And that is not by any means accidental. Now, if you look at Western psychoanalysis, and I say the word Western very distinctly, because if you went to analyze an indigenous society, we might find a very different worldview and social imaginary. But in Western psychoanalysis, for people like Freud and Klein and Lacan, mourning is the primal human condition. We're mourning the loss of primal intimacy, particularly with the mother. We're seeking reconciliation with primal unity, and there's no way back to the Garden of Eden. And that's why Freud has written extensively about war, and basically says that war is a lifting of repression, that, you know, the social strictures are so extensive that we need ways to lift the repression and engage in war or whatever. Melanie Klein has a different approach to mourning and a different approach to why this leads to war. And we all know about the theories of alienation. Alienation by Karl Marx means alienation through our labor power. Mary O'Brien, who's was a brilliant feminist philosopher, talks about the alienation of the male seed in the copulative act. So that's primary. But matri-centered theorists like Genevieve, Vaughan, and others talk about alienation. We are alienated from our origins, from nature, and from the maternal gift. And that might be much more explicitly at the root of mourning and the notion of exile. We are exiled into alienation. Now, the philosopher Heidegger talked about our being born into dereliction. And Melanie Klein understands that as our understanding of dereliction, because we were ejected from the womb, signified by the breast. And her understanding is that this has major consequences. We live in terror of losing mother or losing access to our origins. We live in terror and fury when she does not appear on time. This is the infantile capacity, the infantile consciousness. We project our fear into the mother, but she in turn appears to retaliate against us. And therefore, we have to split between the good mother and the bad mother. The good mother is the one who's there for us all the time. The bad mother is the one who doesn't give us whatever we want on tap, as it were, once we used to live in the Garden of Eden, which is to say her own womb. And therefore, unless we have found a way of mediating between the good mother and the bad mother, we live in a state of in other words, unless we have found a way to mourn the loss of that primal unity, we're going to live in a very conflicted position, which they call the schizoid paranoid position. If we reconcile ourselves with mourning and reconcile ourselves with death, we will realize too that the bad mother and the good mother are one and the same person. And generally then we can, live happily and reconcile ourselves with our human situation and who we are and where we are going. However, we also live in, we talked earlier about the serpent wavering by turns between loving and hating the gods. Again, the psychoanalysts now talk about the death drives. People like Lacan and Freud. In the death drive, we're seeking omnipotence, we're seeking immortality. And we're, in other words, we're so traumatized by the fact that we're going to die that we need to leave behind our monuments, we need to leave behind our empires. Or we're also a death instinct. We're also afflicted by this in the sense that we want to return to the Garden of Eden, but we only return there with infantile emotions. In other words, acute forms of addiction where everything is on tap might represent the death instinct. Now, Luce Irigaray, who is again a brilliant philosopher, and she comments on this. She says, both women and men are born into dereliction, but men symbolize their death drives at women's expense. In other words, like Eve, the woman made me do it. So the woman is a scapegoat throughout Western culture. So the serpent used to waver by turns between loving and hating the gods, but now the splitting and ambivalence is between the good mother and the bad mother. And that is also part of the schizoid paranoid position, because it's not realistic. We're all a complex mixture of good and evil. But now, if you look at the good mother, there's war, according to Melanie Klein, whereas we think, war is caused by hatred. But if you look at the complexity that goes into war, war is a form of perversion. It's a perverse form of love, in the sense that, Freud said, war is a compass card of motives, some good and some evil. And learning to distinguish between them is extremely difficult. But what motivates men to go to war, or what motivates war, is the whole concept of love, the love of country, the love of women, the love of mothers. And the good mother then becomes primary. But that also takes symbolic expression more widely. And there's Mother Russia. Mother Russia. And there are many, many images. It could have been Mother Ireland, could have been, Britannia. There are so many images in the propaganda for which both women and men are willing to go to war and sacrifice their lives. And the propaganda is again ubiquitous. You go to war because you're protecting the good mother. And, it's quite an extraordinary collection of material that we can find about protecting the good mother. And then, of course, the women also say, go and don't. And as we know, in the First World War, women in Britain went around handing out white feathers to any man who didn't go to war. So they were, women are not innocent in all of this. None of us are innocent. That's part of the problem. But now the other thing is, when we behind the so-called love for women is also a contempt, and the contempt is all the way through the discourse. I lived in America when there was a botched attempt to save the hostages out of Iran, and I listened carefully that night to what they were saying. And one guy was saying it was an abortion. The only way for American citizens to demonstrate its willingness to save its citizens would be to demonstrate a willingness to lose them. In other words, the men hadn't complied by getting themselves killed. They escaped. The attempt was foiled by a precipitous withdrawal, in other words, premature ejaculation. And the whole exercise was like trying to organize a picnic for spinsters to the East Coast. And finally, the United States was being held impotent by a handful of fanatics. Now, I always listen to that discourse very carefully because we like to think that we are governed by reason and the myth of rationalism and the philosophies of rationalism. But what I'm trying to say here is that we're not. In fact, we are in the throes of what we call a libidinal economy. Libido drives our decision making as much as our reason does. And again, there were brilliant poets who wrote during the First World War. And again, some of them, the language is extraordinary. A. Houseman says, "For the calling bugle hollows, high the screaming fife replies, gay the files of scarlet follow, woman bore me, I will rise." Wilfred Owen, who was one of the most brilliant anti-war poets, nevertheless wrote in a letter to his mother, "All women, without exception, annoy me." And in the military initiation rites, the soldiers are insulted by comparing them with women, to women. A sergeant will shout at a soldier, "You're a vagina face, you're a used sanitary napkin, you're an abortion, you're a miscarriage, you're a douchebag, you're a used Kotex, you're a little fat vagina, you're an afterbirth, or you're a scumbag." And again, this is right through the language of the military initiation rites or so-called training. So where does this leave us with regard to war? The writer Scott Peck once wrote that a crucial factor in evil is not simply a regressive yearning for mother, which can be used for healing, but rather the attempt to obtain mother without regression, an insistence on receiving mothering without relinquishing either the adult role or any of the power associated with it. And this is where we come again to the splitting between the good and the bad mother. Because even though, people might be motivated to go to war out of love or love for the mother or out of protection, the bad mother comes into the scene pretty quickly. The bad mother is the enemy, killing, raping, defiling, or even raping those women whom the soldiers were sent to liberate. As we know, one of the key discourses running through the current crisis is that, the Russian soldiers were sent in to liberate Ukrainians from Nazism. And yet, over the last week, we have seen some of the horrific stories that have come out of Ukraine, proving that the soldiers were by no means intending to liberate, they were intending to desecrate and to destroy. And so back to the garden, again, in the First World War, Ernst Jünger wrote this, again, as a kind of incentive to the troops. "We will rip away this veil instead of gingerly lifting its corner. We approach as conquerors, armed with all the means of power. We will force open the closed door and enter by force into the forbidden land." Again, back to the Garden of Eden. And for us who have for so long been forced to accumulate in desolate fields of shell holes, the idea of this thrust into the depths holds a compelling fascination. "We will demolish the dikes and break with the storm flood into the broad, untouched region. Every day, new villages and cities appear to our gaze, and rich beauty falls into our fists." And he may as well have been writing about what is happening this week now as we speak in Ukraine. And so all of this is to say that the story that's recounted in the Garden of Eden has not by any means gone away. And the supersession of the woman, or the woman as scapegoat, again, is ubiquitous even today among the discourse. Simone de Beauvoir, one of the leading writers in contemporary feminism, wrote, "It's not in giving life, but in taking life that mankind is raised above the animals. And that is why superiority has been accorded in humanity, not to the sex which gives life, but to that which kills." And in trying to understand, the ubiquitous, the pervasivity of words like sacrifice, whenever anybody goes to war, they sacrifice. But according to Nancy J., she writes, the only action that is as serious as giving birth, which can act as a counterbalance to it, is killing. This again is a form of patriarchal reversing. And she goes on to say, this is one way to interpret the common sacrificial metaphors of birth and rebirth, or birth done better, on purpose, and on a higher, more spiritual, exalted level than mothers do it. And again, the language of birth was prevalent throughout the explosions of the first atom bombs. Some of them described it as the birth of a new world, the first cry of a new world, babies satisfactorily born, or one person wrote, "It's a boy." So, and even though, again, soldiers might go out of love for their mothers or out for the motherland, in the wars in Argentina, Diane Taylor wrote, "What made the patria acceptable, perhaps even necessary within this discourse, was that she was not credited with giving birth to her children. On the contrary, the glorious military men gave birth to her. The patria was empowered by her heroic sons." And I could have also shared another few dozen poems from the Irish situation, where one of the soldiers almost gets into the body of his mother and speaks of his sacrifice, not hers. And so we come to the tomb of the unknown soldier, where there's again complete reversal of life and death. President Harding says, "We do not know the eminence of his birth, but we do know the glory of his death. He died for his country, and greater devotion hath no man than this." Again, patriarchal reversal. So we live, according to some of the French feminist theorists like Julia Kristeva, Luce Irigaray, in a sacrificial social contract. And Irigaray writes that the problem is that when the father refuses to allow the mother her power of giving birth and seeks to be the sole creator, as happened with Adam, then according to our culture, he superimposes upon our ancient world of flesh and blood a universe of language and symbols that has no roots in the flesh, and drills a hole through the female womb and through earth in order to mark out the boundaries of the sacred space in many patriarchal traditions. In other words, that ideology affects not only women and not only men, it also radically affects our understanding and our relationship to nature. It defines a meeting place for men that is based upon an immolation. Women will in the end be allowed to enter that space, provided that they do so as non-participants. The fertility of the earth is sacrificed in order to establish the cultural domain of the father's language, which is called incorrectly the mother tongue. But this is never spoken of, just as the scar of the navel is forgotten. So correspondingly, a hole appears in the texture of the language. And finally, according to Irigaray, she says, if we are not to become accomplices in the murder of the mother, we also need to assert that there is a genealogy of women. In other words, she radically affirms the work that most of us in this seminar will be doing and have done now for many, many years. And so from Nandini Gupta, one of my former students, she sent this image of Durga, because today is Durga Ashtami. the advent of a fearless mother who comes to transform the egoistic manifestations of violence and give a gift of compassion. And the final image I want to give you is an email I received today from another brilliant philosopher, Bracha Lichtenberg-Ettinger, a Jewish artist, psychoanalyst, and theorist, who writes again to try to recuperate, try to find the trace hauntings of liberation from within some of the Hebrew texts. And here she is trying to recuperate the figure of Eve. She says, with one son a murderer and one son killed, Cain and Abel, she still carries again, i.e. working from a matrixial perspective. This is in relation to my notion of carrions. It's symbolic, what it stands for, the symbolic principle of being towards birthing, with being toward birth, bringing it in sorrow to the world, Seth. She brought her son Seth, which means carry, and from carry, with him came Enosh, humanity. So, thank you. I wonder if that will raise some discussion on your part, and I'm more than happy to discuss it with any of you whenever the time comes around again. So thank you for now.
Mary, thank you. That was such a beautiful presentation from the Western culture, taking us all the way from the root of the spirituality and Western tradition, the Bible, to where we are today in this moment. Thank you so much. It's beautiful. We will have time for questions at the end. And there's a question here about the PowerPoint. Of course, the recording is going to be up. We always have our recording up, and you will see the PowerPoint there. But Mary, thank you so very, very much. Our next speaker is Susan Petrelli, and I want to refer you to our website to be able to see her full bio. It's quite extensive, but for now, so that we can just get on to her talk, Susan Petrelli is a full professor of philosophy and theory of languages at the University of Bari Aldo Moro, Italy, where she teaches philosophy of language, Psychoanalysis of law, and international translation, Psychoanalysis of translation. She is the author of many articles and publications. She has developed the translation theory in the framework of global semiotics, linking philosophy of language, semiotics, and biosemiotics. It seems just so timely that we have another wordsmith here who's going to orient us in our language. So, Susan, thank you.
Thanks to you. Thank you very much for the presentation. And thank you, Mary, for that wonderful presentation. I'm less structured today. Jen has asked me to participate. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm going to share a few thoughts and reflections, let's say, which are not as structured as Mary's wonderful presentation. Yes, so I don't have a PowerPoint because I never use PowerPoints because I don't know how to do it. I've been thinking and taking notes and things like that, and would like to begin, yes, talking about language from my perspective, war, language, war, ideology. This meeting is named, is titled War, Peace and War, I think. Or is it the other way around? War and Peace, Peace and War. Anyway, that recalls, brings to mind immediately Guerra e Pace, War and Peace, by the Russian novelist Tolstoy. I don't know whether the connection is deliberate, but the Russian novelist Tolstoy published Peace and Pace Guerra, Peace and War, in the 19th century. That title, that novel, is closely connected to another important novel by Fyodor Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment. We're talking about two of the most famous novels, probably from the 20th century, Peace and War, Crime and Punishment, by two Russian authors. And to think, when this war broke out with Russia invading Ukraine, and of course, how can I say this? An a priori for my discourse is that nobody is innocent. No one is innocent, as Mary, in fact, pointed out. So neither Russia, nor Ukraine, nor the USA, nor Europe, no actors are innocent. But the fact is that Russia invades Ukraine on the 24th of February. And one of the reactions in Italy, an immediate reaction in Italy, was for the university in Milan to ban a professor of Russian and his course on Dostoevsky, one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. And I'm ashamed, absolutely ashamed, that anybody should think to do anything like this, let alone a university, which is supposed to represent culture and educating people to the best, let's say, of human values, in my view of things. No. Dostoevsky, the attempt was made to ban this course, the professor and his course on Dostoevsky. That, of course, immediately provoked a reaction, thank the Lord, and the course continued because people were scandaled. Why do I cite this? It's a war that is carried on through language, a war among identities, a war among ideologies. How can you not recognize the importance for humanity of the work carried out by a writer like Dostoevsky, and identify Dostoevsky with what Russia is doing today? Dostoevsky is one of the main authors who inspires another Russian author who has been at the center of most of my studies, Mikhail Bakhtin. Bakhtin was a young person when he wrote his a series of incredible texts, where it's after the October Revolution, the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s in Russia. There was Bakhtin and his friends who'd formed the Bakhtin Circle, and they were translators and they were philosophers and they were artists. Bakhtin only ever published 2 monographs as a philosopher, monographs dedicated to literary figures. One was on Dostoevsky, the other one was on Rabelais. And through literature, he developed his incredible theoretical and philosophical vision of life and of humanity and of human relationships. And some of the key concepts are concepts like the many languages, heteroglossia, plurilingualism, multiplicity, extra locality, the ability to look beyond the limits of a given identity. Dialogism. Dialogism is an absolutely fundamental concept. It's a life concept. Dialogism is a concept developed in biology. Maturana e Varela, for example, the Chilean biologists da Chile, speak about dialogism in the cycles of life as a biological phenomenon. But there are other biologists also to whom Bakhtin refers. But dialogism of the word, the many voices, the multi-voicedness of the word, of the single word. And we talk about internal plurilingualism, internal to a single language, the condition of plurilingualism, the condition of internal plurilingualism and external plurilingualism. So the point is that there is a situation of multiplicity of words, of languages, a situation of otherness. This is another key concept. Otherness, which is the a priori of communication, the a priori of life. In fact, communication in itself testifies what we're doing now. And I've said this in the past, I think, in this group. Communication is otherness. We communicate, excuse me, I'll just put the phone off. Sorry about that. We communicate as a result of this push towards the other, which is the a priori, which is before this push towards the other, even before the word itself, before intentional communication. Bakhtin is an extraordinary Russian philosopher. I would say for all, a philosopher, obviously, who cannot, but through these categories, this vision, this architectonics of life, cannot but predicate peace, not war, peace. I've selected a few texts. If I have time, I'll read what I can, according to the time that we have available. But this is from Dostoevsky's novel, Crime and Punishment. When convalescing, he remembered the dreams he had while running a high temperature and in delirium. He dreamt that the whole world was ravaged by an unknown and terrible plague that had spread across Europe from the depths of Asia. All except a few chosen ones were doomed to perish. New kinds of germs, microscopic creatures which lodged in the bodies of men, made their appearance. But these creatures were spirits endowed with reason and will. People who became infected with them at once became mad and violent. But never had people considered themselves as wise and as strong in their pursuit of truth as these plague-ridden people. Never had they thought their decisions, their scientific conclusions, and their moral convictions so unshakable or so incontestably right. We're talking about dogmatism, obsession with one's own truth, but only one's own, monological truth, as Bakhtin would say. Whole villages, whole towns and peoples became infected and went mad. Think of COVID. It sounds as though he's describing what happened with COVID before the war, the recent Russian war. They were in a state of constant alarm. They did not understand each other. this was written in the 19th century. It's a description of what's happening now. Each of them believed that the truth only resided in him, and was miserable looking at the others, and smote his breast, wept and wrung his hands. They did not know whom to put on trial or how to pass judgment. They could not agree with what was good or what was evil. They did not know whom to accuse or whom to acquit. Men killed each other in a kind of senseless fury. They raised whole armies against each other, but these armies, when already on the march, began suddenly to fight among themselves. Their ranks broke, and the soldiers fell upon one another, bayoneted, and stabbed each other, hit and devoured each other. In the cities, the tocsin was sounded all day long. They called everybody together, but no one knew who had summoned them or why they had been summoned. And all were in a state of great alarm. The most ordinary trades were abandoned because everyone was propounding his own theories, offering his own solutions, and they could not agree. They gave up tilling the ground. Here and there, people gathered in crowds, adopted some decision and vowed not to part. But they immediately started doing something else, something quite different from what they had decided. And they began to accuse each other, fought and killed each other. Fires broke out, famine spread, wholesale destruction stalked the earth. The pestilence grew and spread farther afield. Only a few people could save themselves in the whole world. Those were the pure and chosen ones, destined to start a new race of men and a new life, to renew and purify the earth. But no one had ever seen those people. No one had heard their words or their voices. That's Dostoevsky, and it really does sound like a description of what's going on in the world today. As I said, COVID, an absolute disaster. It was a moment in which I was hoping that humanity, all of us, would understand that we need to stop and think critically and interrogate language, interrogate dominant ideology, and take responsibility, all of us, in a world that is so, how can I say it, so full of noise, too much communication, not enough silence in the sense of quietude. Silence means the possibility of listening and responding to the other on the basis of listening, which might seem obvious, but it's not. As listening is very, very difficult to understand and to acquire the capacity for listening. I'll give you an example, just a very, how can I say it, simple example. I've been in touch with, I've been to China a few times because of my research and at conferences, etc. And I've met various delightful Chinese colleagues. And in fact, I remember the first time I went to speak in China, it was a discourse, a very critical discourse against dominant language, dominant ideology, and globalization used in a very reductive sense. And I naively thought that the Chinese would understand this critique and even share this critique against the globalization of language that tends to homologate and eliminate difference, a kind of language associated with ideology that wants to make us all the same according to what? according to the logic of a given kind of market. What market is that? The consumerist, capitalist, so-called equal exchange market. Everything is sacrificed as a result at a global level as a function of profit and the market and consumerism to be practiced globally to keep this market going. I think that was pretty naive now that I look back, because globalization in terms of economy is what the world has aspired to without considering other aspects that concern humanity as humanity, the properly human. And this indifference is what has brought us to where we are today, a world which is entering a tunnel that will lead to its own destruction if we don't change politics very quickly. Yes, so I was saying, an example, I think it's just easy if I read from these few lines from my email this morning, if I find it. Let's have a look. I've taken lots of notes. Yes. So this young Chinese colleague wrote to me this morning. She says, "Dear Susan and Professor," and the professor that she had presented herself to me in China. They were, for me, collaborators, very, very close to each other. A wonderful relationship. And so now she says in parentheses, "I just cannot get used to," this was Wishy and Labao, you know, that's how we met them. And I was Susan. So now she says, after all these years, "I just cannot get used to the idea of addressing a former teacher by the name, force of the cultural tradition." So here we were calling each other by first names, Wishy, Labao, Susan, Augusto, and everybody else, my mentor. And so she now says, after all these years, reveals that she's uncomfortable calling her professor by his first name. How do I respond? "I understand, Wishy, I understand you perfectly. I was shocked when I went to China the first time and everybody was speaking to us by first names. I remember how ridiculous it felt. It was the repetition of what I had experienced in the USA years earlier. Everybody using first names, even students. It really seemed out of place. In Italy, it is not at all our way. Now I discover the same truth for China. Nor is this only about the relationship between professors and students, but also about colleagues when relations are formal, as they inevitably must be when you are just meeting each other, and of all places at a conference. I remember feeling terribly uncomfortable for Augusto and me. Then friendship develops and that changes things. A different question. Coming from Australia, where they use first names as in America, in the US, and have no idea of cultural traditions and intricacies, I have spent all my professional life trying to get it right. That is, to understand when to switch to the informal you and use of first names and when not to. I assure you, hardly ever. A very delicate issue as it involves lots of relational aspects. Things are now changing with the younger generations among themselves, not when addressing an older professor. So this again is another example of the dominion of the English-speaking world, in particular the USA, and how it conditions us, a mainstream culture with very little practice in listening to the other. And let me stop here. So, as I said before, I'm not anti-USA or anti-Europe or anti-Australia. We're talking about the human condition, and we're talking about communication in a global world today. But this was an interesting example of what I mean. How can you think that to call a person from the point of view of an English language speaker, how can you think that to call a person by the first name could actually be offensive in a given context? It's an example of dominion over the other, unintentional, well-meaning, but what's happening is that we are losing the nuisance of language, the nuisance, how do you say that? The signifying nuances of a culture. And this is what I mean by the incapacity to listen and the emergency for us to learn to listen to the other and not always overwhelm the other with one's own ideas, with one's own culture. And here, let me read you another few lines by a wonderful American thinker. I spend a lot of my life reading American philosophy with Charles Peirce, semiotics, and Charles Morris. Now, Charles Morris is another, he's a 20th century philosopher, semiotician. Charles Morris is an expert of signs and language also, and he writes this book called The Open Self. He writes it in 1948. After the Second World War has just finished, even Stalin had signed the Yalta Pact for Human Rights, even Stalin. And I mention that because just recently, as we know, the UN has expelled Russia from ONU, which is something that I would question if I'm thinking that my goal is peace and not igniting war. Anyway, what does in 1948 Charles Morris write? Charles Morris loved America, he's USA, but he says, we have not used the term democracy. This is now about exporting democracy. We have, in his whole book, he says now, this is towards the end of his book, we have not used the term democracy. The avoidance was deliberate. For all sweet words are soured by misuse, the misuse, and we were talking about this, the misuse of language with Jen, I think in a very recent meeting. Democracy has become a strongly appraisive term. We use it to appraise, but what does it refer to? Designatively unclear. So he's saying, what do we actually mean by democracy? What's the reference? To call oneself democratic is now as unrevealing and as inevitable as for politicians to be photographed with babies, a common practice. We're all aware of it. It's happening in Italy too now. It was never a practice here in Italy. It happened I saw it in the USA. We've seen it, I think, used to see it in the USA, I think from the 40s, the 50s, certainly the 60s. It's nothing that could have happened here in Italy, just as you wouldn't see politicians with their wives, for example, as you do in America, which has various implications, meaning implications. But anyway, it's all happening. It's a globalized world where we have the vice of imitating the other, perhaps the worst aspects of the other. And so you do see politicians photographed with babies and children here too, and with their wives, etc., etc. So democracy has become a strongly appraisive term, designatively unclear. To call oneself democratic is now as unrevealing and as inevitable as for politicians to be photographed with their babies. We have been told by one who ought to know that when fascism conquers America, it will do so in the name of democracy, which is exactly the case. fascism. Umberto Eco speaks about urfascismo, the eternal fascism of culture and of language that we have to be aware of, that we must defend ourselves against. In fact, whatever is now done in America or elsewhere on the earth will be done in the name of democracy. So we need to talk concretely. None of the grandiose labels we bandy about is of much value today. Labels, stereotypes, hide prejudices, mystifications, alienation, linguistic alienation. The actual problems of the contemporary world are not helped by invoking such overworked words as individualism. What do we mean by individualism? What do we mean by socialism, capitalism, liberalism, communism, fascism, democracy, all on the same level? These terms are loaded appraisals. Each culture and each group will use them to its own advantage. If we were to use the term democracy designatively as referring to something very concrete, it would be synonymous with the phrase open society of open selves. This is the definition that Morris gives of democracy. Open society of open selves. And his book is in fact titled The Open Self. But since we have this more exact phrase, and since no labels are sacred or indispensable, we can dispense with the word democracy. So language is powerful. Language is present everywhere. And with language, ideology and values. There is no such thing as neutrality in language is not possible. We are always expressing a point of view when we speak, when we communicate. We are always expressing values, a vision of the world. Consider what's happening in language today, discussing Europe and Ukraine. The language is going in the direction now of war. It's language about war. It's war language about how to resist war. And the ideas that are circulating is that strongly again, is that the road to peace is through war, which is something that, to my mind, is totally unacceptable. It reminds me of what happened when we bombarded Iraq and carried on a so-called humanitarian war, contraddizione in termini, a contradiction. No war can be humanitarian. War is violence. War is death. War is the defense of identity against another identity. It's the defense of a closed identity as against another identity. War is not peace.
Yes,
Sorry,
I think
we need
that's
to stop.
Yeah, I think that's a good place for us to stop so that we can have some questions following up on your identification of the way in which words are just so important that we need to really think about what we're saying and how twisted and easily manipulated we can become when a word like democracy is thrown around. And it harkens back to exactly what Mary was bringing forward with the mother and how the mother became corrupted with the idea that we fight for the mother rather than the peaceful attributions or the love of the mother is used to instigate war. That kind of a thing. It's very beautiful. are there some closing words you'd like to say for this moment of the session before we open up to some questions, or if you had any questions for Mary, or anything that you'd like to open with the discussion?
Oh, Mary's presentation was full of all sorts of consideration, all sorts of things, and made me think of lots of things, but very rich, like, well, you know, well, Freud, I really dispute the idea of war as love, as a form of love, let's say. As far as I'm concerned, war is destruction, violence, and death. And this made me brought to mind another philosopher, in fact, who is Levinas, Emmanuel Levinas. And Levinas says, you see, because I mean, you know, we're talking about culture and philosophers, and there are so many wonderful philosophers and incredible ideas that actually circulate in discourse without us really knowing. Western philosophy has been, and therefore Western thought and culture has been heavily influenced by Thomas Hobbes, an English philosopher, who said, "Homo homini lupus," man is a wolf for the other man. Man is therefore a threat to the other man. And this is at the basis, he says, of society and humanity. Man afraid of the other man. That is Hobbes' conviction. Then you get somebody like Levinas and many others, but Levinas in particular, he is a 20th century philosopher. He was a Jew persecuted by the Nazis. And in spite of his condition, the persecution, of the fact that his family, he lost most of his family through Nazi persecution, his is a philosophy of otherness and love. A philosophy not of fear of the other, but fear for the other. And this is the kind of philosophy that fascinates me. At the origin, at the very origin, is not fear of the other, but fear for the other. And in fact, fear for the other's safety, fear for the other's happiness, fear for the other's well-being. And in fact, this corresponds to Jen's idea of the mother who nurtures, of language, the expression of nurturing mother. Language and life, which is not possible without care and nurture from the mother or whoever plays the role of the mother. So that was just one thought from Mary's presentation, but many others, but let's listen to everybody else perhaps. Love, I think, is love, peaceful love, hospitality and listening. Listening to the other, answering comprehension. I think these are the values that characterize the properly human, and that we have a right, also human rights, if you like, to cultivate. And I think we can, if we only would listen seriously to the mother, to what nurturing and caring is all about. Anyway, let me.
Thank you, Susan. That's a great place to stop. Mary, did you want to do you have any thoughts about that at the moment? Otherwise, we can jump into some questions.
Well, I'll just as a quick response to the question of war as love, Freud does say in his many writings on war that war is a complex card, a compass card of motives, some good and some evil, and distinguishing between them is very difficult. I'm much more impressed by the work of Melanie Klein, because of course Freud never looked at with one exception, when he wrote Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he did some infant observation of his grandchild, who for some reason he was lumbered with babysitting for a night, and he ended up writing his whole Beyond the Pleasure Principle from that. But Melanie Klein is much more useful theorist in relation to war, particularly since the post-Kleinians such as Bion and Winnicott and Roger Monicarl and Fenari, and particularly the Italian writer Fenari, have written about war as a kind of perverse love, because people are motivated maybe sometimes by hate, but also by love. And it's the perversion of love that is problematic.
Yes, Jen mentions something about that, just a tiny bit, just not quite a leap, but when little boys, instead of the way that they make their contact is to hit, rather than actually hugging, because that's when it gets twisted around, but that's the way that they connect, which
it's culturally induced. This is the point.
Yeah.
It's
Yes.
not by nature, it's culturally induced. This is Levinas and many others with him.
Absolutely.
Learn
Absolutely. So let's take some questions and let's see what's out there. So Liliana.
Yes, I have a question from the Q&A for Mary or both of you. Actually, it is for Mary. Have you done this analysis using the original Hebrew Bible, not the Christian, and also using modern feminist writings onto Hebrew Bible? Can you acknowledge that original sin does not exist in Hebrew Jewish interpretation? Thank you.
As I said, I wrote extensively about the Garden of Eden story. In fact, I wrote about it when I was a graduate student in my doctoral program in Cambridge at Harvard. And I was standing with my bare feet peeling potatoes when next minute somebody came to the door and bashed the door down, and who said, "This needs work, this needs work." He was appalled at the fact that I took the point of view of the serpent in analyzing the Genesis story. So yes, I wrote about the Eve and the serpent and relating it to the Sumerian and Babylonian mythologies in my book, The Serpent and the Goddess, Women, Religion and Power in Celtic Ireland, which is now out of print, but you might be able to get it elsewhere. So yes, I've been very much in touch with feminist Hebrew scholars such as Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza and Savina Tubal and many others. And I'm also very influenced and very appreciative of their work. And in fact, you might have noticed that the last slide I gave you was one from Bracha Lichtenberg Ettinger, who was also, by the way, a good friend of Levinas. And Bracha is Jewish. She's an artist. She is the daughter of Polish survivors of Auschwitz. And she and people like Griselda Pollock and Judith Butler, who is also Jewish, are intent on recuperating some aspects of the Hebrew Bible and retranslating them with a matrixial perspective. By matrixial, Bracha means to some extent influenced by Levinas, the openness to the other and the feminine in particular as the repository of carrions. The one who carries on behalf of the other. And Levinas acknowledged in his later life that that was in fact an excellent metaphor for the opening and the hospitality toward the other. So yes, in relation to original sin, as I said, the Garden of Paradise does indicate original blessing, but it also indicates that the first human couple had been kicked out of it. And as I said, my concern today was analyzing why they were kicked out of it and why they couldn't get back in, and why there has been an extraordinary human attempt to recuperate the mother in warfare, and why the discourse of the mother is used extensively to persuade people to go to war and to motivate them in that sense. So original sin is very much a Christian interpretation. But I don't think we can deny that in the Hebrew Bible, there is also a sense of alienation. There's a sense of being cast out into dereliction. And in addition, again, in my first book, I analyzed some of the stories, such as the story of oh gosh, my memory is not great these days. Jephthah and his daughter, and the implication that was going on there between a matriarchal and a patriarchal worldview or social system, and also the story of Isaac and Esau and Jacob, and why, you know, the mother wanted to choose the younger son because she belonged to a matriarchal system in which ultimogeniture was favored as against primogeniture. And I think anybody looking at the Hebrew Bible and reading it through a struggle that went on in many cultures, whether it's, you know, Hebrew or Greek or Roman, between the matri-centered and the patri-centered worldview, could not avoid seeing that, whether you call it original sin or whether you call it something else, is, you know, up to you. But in the Hebrew Bible, I've also been very influenced by the prophets, who called out consistently, "Would you take the smell of your burning sacrifices out of my nose? I hate them. What I call for is mercy, not sacrifice." And I think mercy is the matrixial and the matri-centered worldview. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Yes, thank you. Susan, are you leaning in because you had a comment, or?
No, I was just thinking that sounds very much like Pope Francis I and his prayers of mercy and compassion. No, I was just thinking.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So Judith, I'm wondering, is there another question for us?
Mrs. Bromley uses the example of, she says, "I waited my whole life to become a wife and mother and a Mrs., and no one uses that anymore." So it's another example of what you were saying about the cultural differences in the use of language. And but the word I would like you to speak a little bit more about is the use of the word peace, and the definition, which I know from Quakers and from Ursula Franklin, for example, that peace is not just the absence of war, but a positive condition or state of well-being. And could you say a little bit about that?
Is that to me?
Yes.
Oh,
Why
okay.
don't you start, Susan? Yes.
Well, that's a very interesting issue, isn't it? Because the common conception of peace is as a truce among wars, between wars, the peace of war. If you consider the world today, as it is designed today, is the expression and the result of war. And when I say this, I'm not saying, I do not believe that war is inevitable. I believe in peace, not the peace of a clean conscience, of a conscience in peace, the peace of a truce among war, but peace as living together, and living together harmoniously, living together dialogically, living together responsively, one towards the other. I do believe that is possible. So I think we need to make this difference, not the peace of wars, but peace outside the paradigm of peace and war, peace as the other face of war. Peace is possible outside the paradigm which is dominated by war. Unfortunately, language also teaches us to reason in oppositional terms, black and white, man and woman, heterosexual, homosexual, good and bad. Which is reasoning according to set categories that can be put one against the other. Mary mentioned at the beginning of a presentation the problem of ambivalence. Ambivalence is a fascinating issue, ambivalence and ambiguity in language. And another example of how we must understand that the word ambiguity, ambivalence in itself is polysemic, ambivalent, has various meanings. Ambiguity, ambivalence can be considered as something negative if it creates confusion, if it leads to conflict, creates problems in human relationships. But ambivalence, ambiguity is also a very positive thing if we consider the wealth, if we consider it as a signifying resource. It's thanks to ambiguity and ambivalence that we can actually talk to each other, and we talk to each other on the basis of ambiguity to the end of trying to understand each other and perhaps agreeing on a viewpoint, on a position, on a belief. But it's a belief that we reach through a journey that involves looking at various possibilities, looking at various different points of view, and then coming to some sort of an agreement, fully aware that that belief is open to interrogation, that we should always be ready to question the belief, the conviction, including questioning myself as a self, as an I, as an identity, armed with his or her own baggage of convictions and beliefs. Again, backed in the importance of dialogism and dialogicality. Peace can only be reached in this kind of humus, in this kind of background. Consider, for example, Europe, but not only Europe, the Americas, the world. Consider it from the point of view of languages. How many languages? Europe, I'll speak for Europe given that I'm here, is full of different languages. A situation of plurilingualism, of multilingualism, also of multi-cultures, many cultures. This is richness, this is wealth. The point is not to put these cultures and differences against each other, but to encourage the dialogue, the wealth of dialogue that can arise from this kind of ambiguity and ambivalence. In Ukraine has many languages and many cultures, amongst which the Russian language. There are Philo-Russians in Ukraine, right? This should be a wealth. What's happened? Dominant politics, in this case, US-driven politics, has encouraged conflict and division among differences. This is something to be taken consideration when we do a history of what is happening today. The fact of the war today is not something that has happened out of the blue. It's something that has been constructed in time through relationships conducted by the politicians whom I consider absolutely incapable, insufficient, inadequate. A politics that is at the service, a slave to economics, to a given type of economics, greedy economics, economics all about self-interest for a given identity, and nothing about giving for the other, with the other, for the sake of the other. Anyway, I'll stop there. I don't know if that answers the question, but this is the only humus possible for peace, for real peace, peace that is not conditioned by war, that is not the other peace in the paradigm, a truce, but peace for peace, peace for the other.
Thanks, Susan. Mary, did you have some words you wanted to share about this idea of peace?
No, just very quickly, just to agree with a lot of what Susan has just said, because peace is not the absence of war. It is the constant education of the heart, educating of the heart in order to be there for the other. And once war breaks out, it's too late. So I never go on a demonstration. Maybe I'm too lazy, but I just think it's, you know, I spent most of my academic life working on the question of war and gender, particularly, and sacrifice. And I think it's a cop-out to, I mean, it may be necessary and people do what they have to do, but I think we need to be constantly vigilant as to what is coming down, and the propaganda in the discourse, propaganda in the images, and even the fact of war as entertainment. I mean, what can we expect when, you know, if you do a quick summary of what comes down as entertainment, it is violence, it is murder, it is rape, it is, you know, and there's very little that comes down to nurture the heart. And that is the key of peace. That is the crucible of peace. And particularly now that religions, and I'm not calling for their recuperation at any level in the traditional sense, in the patriarchal sense, but they have largely lost any compelling ethical stance that most of them might have had. But there's a vacuum out there, and that vacuum is very quickly filled by the good and the bad, and that kind of dichotomy that is out there, and the search for meaning, which finds its location in war and struggle. So I would go back to, and maybe it's because I've been teaching her work this week, to the work of Bracha Ettinger, who talks about the matrixial, very much in line with what Susan has been talking about, the need to be constantly open to the other. But that is a spiritual discipline, and it's one that we don't often cultivate in the midst of the chaos of consumer capitalism.
Can I just say to that it's not a spiritual discipline in a vague sense. It's material. It's about language. It's about signs. It's about encountering the other. I mean, what is more material about the other? It's about ideas coming together in peace. There's nothing more material than an idea. Think that we can destroy what we can destroy with bombs. Whole cities, whole nations, whole civilizations. You don't destroy ideas with bombs. The ideas continue because they are material. They are sign material. Ideas continue traveling as we are doing here now. But peace means justice, means freedom, means love. These are means dialogue, means encounter. These are the values that we are equipped with, and we are equipped to continue spreading, predicating, practicing, not war, not violence, not at all, not at all. Sorry.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Mary. Let's see if Liliana can find another question for us.
Yes, I have a question from Patricia Hurd from Mary. Hello, Mary. Thank you so much for this analysis of certain religious beliefs and their destructive influence on the belief system and cultures of so many centuries and countries of the Western society and of those who are influenced by them. I always wonder why Mother Earth is not recognized as the Garden of Eden, but as a place to be as a punishment. Why knowledge is considered also sinful, and why women are made responsible for all suffering by these stories. Thank you.
How many years do we have to answer that question? It's a very huge question. I'm sorry, I don't have any simple answers for it. I think we are constructed socially and in so many different ways by patriarchal thinking. And that is a function of power, and it's also a function of weaponry, because the reality is, no matter how many good ideas we have, once, you know, we always thought that when that when nuclear weapons were made, that was the end of war because nobody would ever dare to use them. But Putin has turned all that around. Putin has turned around, well, you can't resist me because I will use my weapons, and that'll be the end of the world. And everybody knows that now, that is perfectly true. I think the Garden of Eden story, just to get back to it a little bit, why is knowledge considered problematic? I think it is, we have to go back to Melanie Klein and look at the way she talks about, when the infant is born into the world, there's a struggle going on between envy and gratitude. Freud would have called that between eros and thanatos, or life and death. She talks about it as a struggle between envy and gratitude. And it's the struggle of coming to consciousness, and the imperative to come to consciousness about the conflicting energies that each of us carry as human beings. And I think that is the knowledge of good and evil and the choices that we have to make. And I'm sorry, but I would insist that it is a spiritual discipline. It is a conscious choice to discipline oneself into constantly being aware of the ambivalence of our position and of our need to be open to the other. And so the other thing about the stories is, yes, that particular version of the original story, and I'd also encourage people to read the version in Sumer and in Babylon, and there are several other Irish versions of the story as well. They're all dealing with how are we going to be dealing with the tragedy of the human condition, in particular the fact that we're all going to die. And many theorists have written extensively about what the fear of death has to do with all of war and peace, of the possibility of war and peace. So I think it's really also extremely important, and this is why a lot of the work of these salons has been so important, is to go back to the older traditions where people did appear to live in harmony, and still do, in the native indigenous traditions. And for instance, in one of the Irish stories, we have to keep on looking for the matrixial traces, the trace hauntings of another possibility. And in one story, I do talk about the goddess Macha in the Irish situation. And she was, said to considered to be the sun goddess, or a representative of the sun, but she came upon a widower one day who was very lonely, and she moved in with him and baked the bread and lit the fire and went to bed with him that night. And they lived very, very happily until the king came, and he was running horse races on the local beach. And Macha said to her husband, she said, "Please don't go down there. Nothing good is going to come of this." And he insisted, he really wanted to go down there, a little bit of fun. And she says, "Well, if you go down there, at the very least, don't mention my name." And he said, "Okay, I won't, not a bother on you." So he went down, and the king's horses were racing against one another. And the king turned around. He was delighted. He said, "I've never in my whole life met horses as strong as mine and as brilliant as mine." And Macha's husband shouted out, my wife can run faster than your horses." And so the king was absolutely furious, and he insisted on getting the husband and threatened to execute him unless he brought his wife down and ran against the horses of the king. And so Macha came down to the strand. She was dragged down because otherwise her husband was going to be executed. She was dragged down to the strand, and she stood there with the horses, and she pleaded to the assembled people. And this is a cry that I think is so important for human culture. She said, "A mother bore each one of you. Help me in my hour of need." And in saying a mother bore each one of you, she was appealing both to a universal principle, but also to a particular principle. So she resolved the dialectic between the universal and the particular by appealing to motherhood. And the people ignored her. And so she had to run the race. And at the last minute, she cried out, she said, in the hour of your greatest need, you will be as weak as a woman in childbirth. And she put a curse on the people of Ulster. And some people would maybe hold that that curse still, resides on the north of Ireland up to today. But I often go back to what lines like that, and there are very few of them in the written material, because the written material in medieval times was written by the winners, largely about the losers, and it was written by those who had the economic means to pay for the surplus labor that put these stories into history. And the voices of women can only be heard, and this is why it's so important to keep on recuperating them through symbolism and through ritual. Ritual in particular is one of the oldest expressions of human interaction, and that's the area to which I would appeal at this point in order to understand where we can recuperate a better kind of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Susan, I don't know if you had any words you wanted to offer to that question, even though it wasn't directed to you.
I'd like just to go back to the concept of peace. This is something that I wrote just a few lines back in 2005, I think it was. Truly subversive pacifism is pacifism against the peace of wars, peace resulting from war. Because as I said, the world is designed as a result of war. To will peace, to want peace is not enough, for it simply means to walk with the pacifiers of conscience, of the consciousness. Those with a conscience at peace. I've done my duty, my mind, I'm at peace. This is often accompanied by indifference towards the other. My conscience is at rest. I've done what I possibly can. It is a question of not wanting this peace, the peace of war, of not feeling at peace. Feeling at peace is a way of subduing our consciousness, our conscience towards the other. So it is a question of not wanting this peace, the peace of war, of not feeling at peace. Given that this is peace imposed and authorized by war. Pacifism, which does not want the peace of this world, the world as it is, the world as we know it today, the peace of cemeteries. Pacifism, which is not accomplice of the peace of this world. Pacifism, which is favorable to a world where peace is not obtained through war, and which is for change in this world at peace, the effect and cause of war. So it's not enough just to be at peace with one's own consciousness, when this often means being at peace with the world as it is, instead of engaging in discourse and critical consciousness and taking responsibility for social change. That was just an afterthought related to the question of peace.
Thank you, Susan. Mary, I have a question for you. You've been referring to your book, which was your dissertation, if I recall. No? Is that okay? So the book that you're referring to, your early writing, is it The Serpent and the Goddess? Is that the book that you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The Serpent and the Goddess, Women, Religion, and Power in Celtic Ireland. And did I hear you say that unfortunately it's not in print?
It's out of print at the moment, yeah.
Okay.
It's gone through 7 or 8 printings, but it is out of print right now. You can get it for about €400, I think, on the internet. But I wouldn't advise anybody. And if anybody particularly would like to read the chapter I wrote on Eve and the Serpent, I'd be more than happy to send it. If they just let me know. I'll send you a PDF of that chapter.
Mary, you could send it to us and we could put it up with this.
Sure. Okay. I'd be happy to do that. Yeah, because I've gone into the issues much more extensively there than is possible in this conversation. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. And Diane can put that up for us with this recording.
Okay.
Okay, Judith, do you have another question for our speakers? And I see that we have only a few more minutes left. Can it be a short one?
When are questions ever short? Ruth Miriam says, a tragedy that we are all going to die. That's an interpretation. She says she's 90 years old and her death will not be it just disappeared from here. And her death will not be her tragedy. I will add that her death would be our tragedy because the world is a more interesting place with her in it. But I just wonder if you could comment on the dichotomy or the contrast between life and death as good and bad, as positive and as tragedy.
Well, that wasn't a short question, was that, Judith?
I don't think.
I don't know if anyone. Okay, let's try. Let's give that a try. Who would like to go first, Mary or Susan? Do you have something short you can offer with that?
Mary?
Well, I've been very influenced in my work on gender and sacrifice by the work of Ernst Becker, who wrote several books on death and immortality, or on the denial of death as being something that drives what we call the death drives, which is, you know, the impetus towards omnipotence. And I'm also very influenced by the necessity to develop a tragic vision, such as people like Pascal would have written about, and many others. That that in the light of the fact that we are going to die, we embrace the tragedy of the human condition, as the questioner has embraced it. She says she's 90 years of age and she's going to die, and that's fine. But for many of us, for some of us, that is a problem. But once I don't know what else to say, but I know that for Putin, for instance, and I don't know what I don't want to be psychoanalyzing Putin, but I do know, for instance, that he had a very tragic childhood. His mother was pulled out of a pile of corpses on the understanding that she was dead, and she was brought back to life, and he was born 5 years later. But then he was abandoned. So, the impetus to find something omnipotent, including immortality, may be the consequence of trauma. I really don't know.
Thank you, Mary. Susan, do you have anything short you might want to offer to that?
Short, because it's such a big issue, isn't it?
I know, it's a very large.
How competent I am, but death, citing Levinas, is always a scandal. And I've always thought, if we think of each one of us, each one is special as a singularity, as an unrepeatable, each one, an unrepeatable singularity on this world. So the commentator was right when she said, the world is a different world without our 90-year-old interlocutor in the world. It makes a difference. So death is always, from this point of view, a loss, and always a scandal, whether it's the death of a child or the death of an old person. And that's one I think important aspect of death. The other, from a global biosemiotic point of view, death goes together with life. There is no life without death. There is no death without life. So you can see life and death as companions together, in a sense, for life. The problem is when we have violent death. This is the problem. When death becomes criminal, when death is therefore criminal destruction of the other, that is what is unacceptable.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Mm.
Well, I think we're at a good place to close. Maybe there's some a last sentence or two that Mary, you'd like to offer before I actually take us to the close? Is there something else you'd like to say to the group before we close?
Just to say that the tragedy of the human condition has a particular reference to time and our understanding of time in the Western culture, and in cultures that understand, life as being cyclical. We are born and we live and we die, but we may come back again in a different form. The tragedy of death doesn't seem to be as acute. So again, our worldview, the social imaginary, is so hugely important, and sacrifice is related to time, because in the Western world, we delineate time by the First World War and the Second World War, and it used to be before Christ and after Christ. Now it's before the war and after the war, and anticipating the next one. And so sacrifice has that other dimension of delineating time, which can only be superseded by a renewed focus on mercy, which to me is my understanding of mercy is we do not achieve our identity at somebody else's expense. Thank you.
And in fact, Levinas says time, rather than chronological time, time as time for the other, time as the relationship to otherness and to the other. It's another concept which is well worth exploring, I think.
Sure.
That would be a brilliant discussion in another salon about the gifts of time. I like that idea. Susan, is there something that you'd like to close with, and then I'll take us to the...
No, I think this idea of time as the time of otherness, what Mary was pointed out, time, I think, is an absolutely crucial, very important aspect and relevant to this group, because rather than chronological time, we can talk about the time of nurturing, the time of caring, the time of loving, the time of otherness, which is something else by comparison to the chronological time, the time of history, the time of peace and war, the time of events as they follow on from each other. There's another time which enters the Bakhtin speaks about the great time, which is the great time of otherness, the great time of responsibility, the great time of answerability, the great time of listening, by contrast to the small time of closed identity, of ego-central, ego-centered identity, or selfish identity. So rather than that, with Levinas, the time of otherness; with Bakhtin, the great time of answerability.
Thank you so much, Susan.
And then just let me say, the serpent, I love that metaphor. It's such an important figure in Australian Aboriginal culture. The serpent, the great serpent in Australian Aboriginal culture is the serpent that creates the world, the hills and the valleys and life. It's just wonderful.
Peggy Reeve Sandys has a brilliant book about that, on the serpent in Aboriginal culture. Her father, who was an anthropologist, discovered a big crater. And she went to the Aborigines and the indigenous people and asked them about their worldview. And they said, well, they wouldn't answer her rhetorically. They said, okay, we'll paint. And they produced a brilliant collection of beautiful paintings. And the serpent is at the center of every one of them.
Yeah. But it's if we could it would be so simple to create a peaceful, I think, world if we would only listen to these Aboriginal and Indigenous cultures who live so closely to the earth. They listen to the earth. And in fact, how can we avoid war when we compromise and destroy the earth that gives us life? If we don't develop a consciousness of a loving consciousness towards our environment, ecology, how are we going to avoid war among the people who inhabit this planet? It's all interconnected, and it's the Indigenous populations that show us the way, that teach us this, that give us the lesson of peace.
Absolutely. And that's such a beautiful segue just to say that Genevieve's book, The Gift in the Heart of Language, is coming out shortly in Italian. It will be published in Italian. So
absolutely. And I wrote the preface.
Wonderful. And so I want to thank both Mary and Susan. You know, your offerings today were so brilliant, and it was such a breath of fresh air from this idea of having to defend against the violence that's coming in about war. This invitation for us to really open and breathe into the listening so that peace really can enter into the conversation, that we can find a place for, as opposed to of the other, but for and with the other, that we can be together in this peace. So thank you both very much. I also want to thank Diane and Elena, who are always behind the scenes, making sure that they have our backs in the technology, that we stay fully supported. I want to thank Liliana and Judith for carefully watching all the comments and the Q&A. And for those of you who entered questions into the Q&A and you did not receive an answer, I want to just mention again that we make sure that our presenters, Mary and Susan, will get copies of the questions, the answers, and the attendees with their email addresses, so that perhaps they might be able to respond to you directly if and when they have time. So thank you all so very much. And with these last few moments, I would just like to invite you just for 10 seconds to just stop and breathe and listen to your own heart. Both Mary and Susan are inviting us to just really be present and aware, not only of our own words, but of the words of the other, and listen deeply, that we all can come to a place of peaceful harmony, a way of coming together at the table. And as Jen might point out in this moment, that the maternal roots, matrixical, as Mary Condren has spoken often in her talk, the maternal roots of the gift economy, if we can have the courage to return, we need that space that we can breathe and reach deep into our roots to make the choices to move forward together for a more sustainable, peaceful world that allows for conscious creativity and deep, deep love. So with that, I want to invite you all back on April the 23rd for our 31st Salon. We have Nene Jordan, who will be with us for sure. We're not sure about the second person, but it's Gifts of the Womb. So our recording for today will be posted to our website, the maternalgifteconomymovement.org. If you have any other questions or comments, either for us in organizing or for our speakers, please send them to us directly at the Maternal Gift Economy, the Maternal Gift Economy at gmail.com. So everyone, we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
And
Please.
can we just remember Jen? She's flying, I think, at
Yes.
the moment. She left Italy this morning at 10 o'clock and she's on her way to the US if she's not already there. So a thought to Jen and all the very best to her.
Absolutely. Best wishes for her courage. She's for many of us, we haven't actually gotten on a plane for 2 years.
So true. So true.
Okay, everyone, be safe.
Okay, thank
Stay
you.
well.
Thank you.
And be
Thank
kind to
you.
one another. We'll see you soon. Take good care.
Ciao. Ciao.
Bye for
Thank
now.
you.
Ciao.